The reflection in the oily rainwater wasn't just a shadow, it was a signature of intent. And in Yeoksam-dong, Choi Sung-jin owned every shadow. He didn't share his streets, he didn't share his silence, and he sure as hell didn't share the girl who had been the only bright thing in his peripheral vision for 3 weeks. Sade had muttered something about a fallen scooter and a broken phone, her eyes fixed on the wet pavement. But Sung-jin had made his decision the moment the neon light hit the purple swelling on her cheek. Whatever creep had decided to haunt her just became a ghost in waiting. Beelin's soul was transitioning into its late-night rhythm. Outside, the high-octane pulse of Gangnam's elite was visible through the rain-streaked glass, men in 5,000,001 suits and women who smelled of French perfume. Inside, the low thrum of K-bass house music competed with the steady rhythm of Sung-jin's pulse as he watched her move. Before we continue the story and want to see what happens next, please subscribe to our channel and let us know in the comments where you're watching from. Your support helps us bring these stories to life. 3 weeks. That's how long she'd been delivering to his private table. That's how long he'd been cataloging her. He knew the exact angle of her head when she thought she was alone. He knew the way she flinched at the sound of heavy boots behind her, but never at his. It was as if some part of her soul already recognized the difference between a common predator and an apex guardian. He shouldn't be looking. She was a delivery girl, an outsider in a district that devoured outsiders. He had codes for a reason, lines that kept his empire efficient and his heart cold. But Sade had a way of making his codes feel like suggestions. When she first arrived, she had been a lightning bolt, quick-witted, bold enough to hand-deliver his order without bowing, her laughter echoing in the sterile hallway. There had been a fire in her then, the kind that made him wonder how she'd look under the silk sheets of his penthouse rather than the rain-soaked yellow vest of a courier. But that fire had been snuffed out recently, replaced by a hunch in her shoulders and a frantic habit of checking her rear-view mirror. Despite the humid Seoul night, Sung-jin watched her approach him now. His lieutenants were busy arguing over the distribution of a new shipment, but Sung-jin saw what they missed. He saw the way she gripped the delivery bag until her knuckles turned white. He saw how her breathing turned into shallow, jagged hitches the moment she stepped within 6 feet of him. She wasn't afraid of the Mafia boss. She was terrified of what was waiting for her back in the rain. Yeoksam-dong didn't sleep. It merely changed its skin. As the sun dipped below the jagged horizon of Gangnam's skyscrapers, the corporate suits retreated, replaced by the neon pulse of late-night lounges, underground dens, and the low hum of black sedans idling at curb corners. From the floor-to-ceiling windows of his private office, Choi Sung-jin watched the transition with the detached gaze of a god watching an ant colony. To the public, he was a venture capitalist with interests in urban development. To the streets, he was the gravity that held the district together, quiet, invisible, and impossible to escape. He didn't need to bark orders or flash a weapon. His dominance was woven into the very infrastructure of the neighborhood. The doormen at the exclusive clubs bowed a fraction lower when his name was whispered. The street vendors kept the sidewalk clear of his favorite parking spots without being asked. Sung-jin lived by a clock that began at midnight, and his ritual always started the same way. He would sit at the window, a glass of neat whiskey sweating in his hand, and wait for the yellow flash of a delivery bike to cut through the rain. Sade Williams was the only variable in his world that he hadn't curated. She was a silhouette of kinetic energy, weaving through the gridlock of Gangnam with a reckless grace that bordered on the suicidal. For 3 weeks, she had been his silent obsession. It wasn't just the way she navigated the hostile, crowded streets of a city that clearly didn't know what to make of her. It was the way she carried herself when the helmet came off. When she arrived at his building to drop off his nightly order of dark roast coffee and a single pastry, he would watch her on the security monitors first. She would shake the rain from her hair, a quick, defiant motion that reminded him of a thoroughbred after a race. She was vibrant, her skin a deep, rich contrast to the sterile gray marble of his lobby. She never looked down. In a culture of polite bows and averted gazes, she met everyone's eyes with a steady, searching fire. Sung-jin found himself timing his breaths to her ascent in the elevator. By the time she reached his floor, he would be seated at his desk, his face a mask of cold professionalism. He was a man who lived by codes, rules that dictated he stay 10 steps removed from the help. But as the days bled into weeks, the lines were blurring. He found himself looking for reasons to extend their interactions, noting the way her voice sounded like a warm melody in the cold, high-ceilinged room. Tonight, however, the ritual felt jagged. As he watched her bike pull up to the curb through his binoculars, something was off. The fluid, aggressive speed was gone. She parked the bike with a hesitant, jerky motion, as if her limbs were made of glass. When she stepped into the harsh glow of a street lamp, Sung-jin's grip tightened on the glass until the knuckles of his tattooed hand turned white. She wasn't shaking the rain off. She was looking over her shoulder. Her posture, usually a straight line of defiance, was curved inward, protective and small. She looked like someone who had spent the last hour realizing they were no longer alone in the dark. Sung-jin didn't move, but the temperature in the office seemed to drop 10 degrees. He watched her enter the lobby, his eyes tracking her every micro-expression on the screen. The fire he had come to rely on wasn't gone, but it was buried under a layer of raw, vibrating fear. He set his drink down, the crystal clinking sharply against a mahogany desk. In Yeoksam-dong, everything was accounted for. Every debt was tracked, every shadow was owned. And as he watched Sade Williams step into the elevator, clutching her delivery bag like a shield, Choi Sung-jin realized that someone was attempting to steal something that, by right of his own silent obsession, now belonged to him. The king of Yeoksam-dong didn't like intruders, and he liked threats to his peace even less. Tonight, the ritual wouldn't end with a simple cup of coffee. Tonight, the hunt was beginning. The humidity of the Seoul night clung to Sade like a second skin, but it wasn't the heat that made her skin crawl. It was the itch, that prickling sensation at the base of her neck that told her she was being watched. As she kicked her delivery scooter into gear outside a late-night barbecue joint in Gangnam, she didn't look back. She had learned the hard way that looking back only confirmed the terror, and right now, she needed to believe she was just being paranoid. But the headlights behind her didn't turn when she made a sharp right toward the maze-like alleys of Yeoksam-dong. They stayed a constant, predatory distance away, two pale eyes tracking her through the smog and the neon glare. Sade tightened her grip on the handlebars, her knuckles aching. She knew these streets better than most locals, but tonight, the familiar glow of the Hangul signs felt alien, like a forest of electric trees hiding a wolf. She began to deviate from her GPS. Instead of the main thoroughfares where CCTV cameras and late-night crowds offered a thin veil of safety, she swerved into the narrow, dangerous routes, the steep, winding inclines, and the skeletal stairways that only scooters could navigate. She was trying to break his line of sight, but the psychological weight of Ethan Crowley was heavier than any physical pursuit. She could almost feel his gaze pressing against her back, a cold hand reaching through the rain. Every time she rounded a corner, her heart hammered a frantic rhythm against her ribs, competing with the mechanical whine of her engine. She took a sharp left into an alley so narrow her mirrors nearly clipped the damp brick walls. It was a shortcut used by old residents, unlit and smelling of wet trash and forgotten things. This was the flicker, the moment where her independence, the very thing she had moved across the world to claim, felt like a liability. She was a black woman in a city that often treated her as a ghost, and now a real ghost was following her home. The bruise on her cheek, hidden beneath the strap of her helmet, throbbed with every pulse of her heart. It was a reminder of their last encounter, a physical mark of a man who didn't understand the word no. She pushed the scooter faster, her tires skidding slightly on a patch of wet metal plating. She was taking risks now, weaving through construction zones and bypassing red lights, her eyes darting to her rearview mirror every 3 seconds. The shadow was still there, muted, persistent, and terrifyingly patient. She wasn't just delivering food anymore, she was delivering herself through a gauntlet. Her breath came in shallow, jagged gasps, fogging the visor of her helmet. The vibrant girl who used to hum along to the music in her earbuds was gone, replaced by a hunted animal counting the blocks until she reached the only place in the district that felt like neutral ground. She headed toward the high-rise, where Choi Sung-jin waited. She didn't know why, but the thought of his cold, unreadable eyes felt like a sanctuary compared to the frantic, sweating heat of Ethan's obsession. As she emerged from the dark alleyway back into the neon wash of the main street, she saw the silhouette of Sung-jin's building looming like an obsidian needle against the clouds. She pushed the throttle to the limit, the itch on her neck burning like a fever. She just had to make it to the lobby. She just had to get within reach of the man who owned the shadows, before the shadow behind her finally decided to strike. The obsidian needle of the Choi building usually signaled the end of the gauntlet, but tonight, the finish line was empty. When Sung-jin stepped out into the humid air of the Yeoksam-dong sidewalk, the heavy silence of the street felt wrong. His car was idling 10 feet away, guarded by 2 men who looked like shadows in tailored wool, but his eyes were fixed on a splash of violent, artificial yellow lying against the gray curb. It was her delivery bag. It lay on its side like a fallen soldier, the strap twisted and the insulated lining exposed to the rain. A few feet away, her scooter remained on its kickstand, the engine still ticking as it cooled, but the seat was empty. Sung-jin moved toward it with a slow, predatory, deliberate pace. His men shifted, sensing the change in the atmosphere, the sudden, sharp drop in the temperature of his presence. He didn't ask them what happened. He knew they had been watching the perimeter, but the maze of Gangnam had a way of swallowing people in the blind spots between the neon. He knelt by the curb, the expensive fabric of his trousers soaking up the dirty rainwater, and picked up a small, jagged object lying near the bag. It was her phone. The screen was a spiderweb of shattered glass, the backlight flickering weakly, like a dying pulse. He swiped his thumb across the cracked surface, and for a second, the display held a series of missed calls from an unknown number and a half-composed text message that ended in a chaotic string of characters. The rules of business that Sung-jin lived by were built on the foundation of cold logic. You didn't react with emotion. You reacted with a calculated move. You didn't protect people because you cared. You protected them because they were assets. But as he held the broken device in his palm, the cold logic shattered along with the glass. This wasn't a business disruption. This was an intrusion. Someone had reached into his world, into the one quiet ritual that kept his humanity anchored, and tried to snuff it out. The itch Sade had felt earlier had finally drawn blood. Sung-jin stood up, his face as unreadable as a frozen lake, though his eyes burned with a dark, terrifying clarity. He looked at the shattered phone, then at the dark mouth of the alleyway just 20 yards away. He could see the faint, fresh scuff marks of sneakers in the grime. 2 sets, one light and frantic, the other heavy and certain. "Mateo," Sung-jin said, his voice a low, vibrating hum that barely carried over the sound of the rain. His lead lieutenant stepped forward, bowing his head. "Sir, lock down the district. Every camera, every parking garage, every basement level in a 5-block radius. I want the feed from the convenience store on the corner from 3 minutes ago." He paused, his fingers tightening around the broken phone until the plastic casing groaned. "And find me the man in the hooded jacket. He thinks he's been watching her. He's about to find out what it feels like to be watched by me." The bag stayed on the curb, a bright, lonely stain against the darkness, but the man who had been watching from the penthouse was gone. The king of Yeoksam-dong had stepped off his throne and into the mud. For 3 weeks, he had been a silent observer, but as he stepped into the mouth of the alley, the business of the Mafia ended and the retribution of Choi Sung-jin began. This wasn't about territory anymore. It was about the girl who hummed to the music in her ears, and the man who had dared to make her stop. The back room of the security hub beneath the Choi building was a sanctuary of cold, oscillating light. Dozens of monitors lined the walls, casting a flickering blue glow over the faces of the men who operated them. In the center of this digital hive, Sung-jin stood perfectly still, his eyes tracking the playback of a dozen different angles. In Gangnam, privacy was a myth maintained for the comfort of the wealthy. The reality was a web of high-definition lenses that captured every heartbeat on the street. "Start from the Yeoksam-dong intersection, 30 minutes ago," Sung-jin commanded, his voice as sharp as a scalpel. Mateo's fingers flew across the keyboard. On the main screen, the graininess of the rain-slicked street sharpened into clarity. There she was, Sade, her yellow vest a lonely beacon moving through the gray. And there, emerging from a blind spot behind a parked luxury SUV, was the hooded figure. Ethan Crowley didn't move like a man in a hurry. He moved with the sickening patience of someone who believed he had already won. "Zoom in on the reflection in the shop window," Sung-jin directed. The image bloomed, pixels knitting together to reveal the stalker's face beneath the hood. It was a face defined by a terrifying lack of distinction, plain, unremarkable, the kind of face that could vanish into a crowd in seconds. But his eyes were wide, fixed on the back of Sade's helmet with a feverish, proprietary intensity. He wasn't just following her, he was consuming her. Run the facial recognition against the guest lists of every club in the district. Cross-reference with the immigration database and local police filings for harassment, Sung-jin ordered. The machine began to hum, a low-frequency growl that matched the vibration in his own chest. One by one, the digital breadcrumbs began to appear. Ethan's image popped up in a dozen different locations over the last 48 hours, standing outside Sade's small apartment building, sitting in a parked car near her favorite lunch spot, and hovering at the edge of the park where she sometimes took her breaks. He had been mapping her life, carving out a territory around her that he had no right to occupy. He's smart, Mateo whispered, pointing to a screen showing Ethan ducking into a stairwell to avoid a primary street camera. He knows the dead zones. He knows the city's dead zones, Sung-jin corrected, his gaze narrowing as he watched Ethan grab Sade's arm in the alleyway playback from 10 minutes ago. He saw the struggle, the way she fought to keep her balance, the way her phone was knocked from her hand and shattered against the asphalt. He saw Ethan drag her toward the darkness of a service entrance that led into the labyrinth of the basement levels. But he doesn't know mine. Sung-jin reached out, his finger tracing the path Ethan had taken on the digital map of the building. The stalker had led her into a section of the district where the power lines were old, and the security was outsourced to a third-party firm, a firm Sung-jin had bought out 6 months ago. Mateo, send the signal to the Yeoksam-dong grid, Sung-jin said, his voice dropping to a whisper that carried the weight of a death sentence. Isolate the service elevators in the north block. If he tries to leave that basement, I want every door to become a wall. He thinks he's found a place where no one is watching. Let's show him what it's like to be trapped in the dark with the man who owns the light. The digital manhunt was over. They had his name, his face, and his current coordinates. On the screen, a red blinked steadily in the basement of a commercial complex 3 blocks away. Sung-jin turned away from the monitors, the blue light reflecting off the tattoos on his neck like war paint. He didn't need the screens anymore. He had seen enough. The rules of business had been replaced by a much older law, the law of the apex. As he headed toward the door, his men fell in line behind him, a silent, lethal tide ready to crash against the man who had dared to touch what was never his. The service elevator of the Yeoksam-dong complex was a tomb of galvanized steel and flickering fluorescent light. It smelled of industrial cleaner and stale air, a stark contrast to the rain-washed streets Sade had been desperate to escape. She leaned against the cold metal wall, her breath coming in ragged, visible plumes. She had abandoned her bike, abandoned her bag. Everything but the primal need to put a locking door between herself and the shadow. She pressed the button for the lobby with a trembling finger, her eyes fixed on the gap between the sliding doors, praying for them to close. The doors groaned, beginning their slow, mechanical crawl. But just as the gap narrowed to a sliver of light, a pale, scarred hand shot through. The safety sensor tripped. The doors retreated with a mocking hiss, revealing Ethan Crowley. He wasn't running. He wasn't panting. He stood there in his damp, hooded jacket, a thin, crooked smile playing on his lips that didn't reach his eyes. Those eyes were wide, bloodshot, and fixed on Sade with a terrifying, intimate familiarity. To him, this wasn't an assault. It was a reunion. He stepped into the confined space, the scent of wet wool and unwashed skin suddenly overwhelming the small cabin. "You're fast, Sade," he whispered, his voice a dry rasp that made her skin turn to ice. "I almost lost you at the stairwell. But I knew you'd come here. You always go for the high ground when you're scared. It's a habit. I've been keeping a list of your habits." Sade backed into the corner, her hands up in a futile, defensive posture. The elevator was a cage. There were no cameras here, not the ones she knew of, anyway, and the soundproofing was designed to keep the noise of heavy machinery in, not the screams of a woman out. "Stay away from me, Ethan," she managed to say, her voice cracking. "The police, the building security." Ethan laughed, a soft, jagged sound. He reached out, his fingers tracing the air inches from her face, hovering over the bruise he had given her 2 nights ago. "The police don't care about a delivery girl who doesn't belong here. And security? I walked right past them. People like you and me, Sade. We're invisible. That's why we're perfect for each other. I'm the only one who really sees you." He stepped closer, invading her personal space until she could feel the heat radiating off him. He felt bold, empowered by the isolation. In his mind, the world had shrunk down to this steel box. He was the king of this 5x5 kingdom, and she was finally his captive audience. He reached for the collar of her yellow vest, his movements slow and proprietary. He wanted to savor the moment the fire finally went out of her eyes. "Don't touch me," she hissed, a final spark of defiance flickering in her gaze. "Who's going to stop me?" Ethan countered, his face inches from hers. "Look around, Sade. We're alone. No neon lights, no crowds, no busy streets. Just the dark. You've been running for 3 weeks, but the road ends here." He gripped her shoulder, his fingers digging into her skin with a strength born of obsession. He thought he had calculated every variable. He thought he had found the perfect dead zone in the heart of the city. He was so consumed by his own sense of triumph that he didn't notice the subtle change in the elevator's vibration. He didn't see the small, red LED of the emergency speaker flicker from green to a steady, pulsing crimson. Ethan leaned in to whisper a final, crushing word into her ear, but the sound was drowned out by a sudden, jarring thud. The elevator didn't move toward the lobby. Instead, it lurched violently, the cables groaning as the car began to descend into the sub-basement levels that didn't exist on the public directory. The lights above them flickered once, twice, and then died completely, plunging the predator and his prey into an absolute, suffocating darkness. Ethan's grip loosened in surprise, his breath hitching. For the first time that night, he wasn't the only one who was afraid. He thought he was alone with her, but the shadows he loved so much had just changed sides. The darkness wasn't the empty absence of light. It was a physical weight that descended upon the sub-basement levels of Yeoksam-dong like a heavy velvet shroud. Inside the stalled elevator, the silence was so absolute that the frantic, wet sound of Ethan Crowley's breathing seemed to echo off the steel walls. On the street level, the glowing neon arteries of the block had flatlined. On Choi Sung-jin's command, the vibrant, chaotic pulse of Gangnam had been severed, leaving a 3-block radius in a state of artificial midnight. Inside the car, Ethan's grip on Sade's shoulder vanished. The predatory confidence that had fueled him for 3 weeks was built on the assumption that he was the only one who knew how to navigate the shadows. Now, the shadows had swallowed him whole. He fumbled for his phone, his movements jerky and panicked, but as the screen flared to life, it showed no signal, only a mocking, crimson notification that the system was under external override. "What is this?" Ethan hissed, his voice cracking, the bravado replaced by a high-pitched vibration of fear.
Sade.
"What did you do?" Sade didn't answer. She was pressed into the corner, her heart hammering a rhythm of survival. She realized, with a clarity that cut through her terror, that the darkness wasn't meant for her. It felt protective. It felt like the cold, silent office of the man who watched her every night. She realized that the itch she had felt wasn't just the stalker. It was the gaze of a guardian who had finally decided to step into the light by taking it away. A low, mechanical hum vibrated through the floorboards. Slowly, the elevator doors began to slide open, but they didn't reveal the lobby. They opened onto a vast, cavernous parking garage lit only by the rhythmic, pulsing red of emergency strobes. The light didn't help. It only carved the world into jagged fragments of deep shadow and bloody glare. "Get out," a voice boomed over the emergency intercom. It wasn't the tinny, distorted voice of a security guard. It was deep, resonant, and carried the terrifying calm of a man who had already decided the ending of the story. Ethan grabbed Sade's arm, trying to pull her with him as he stumbled out into the concrete expanse, but the moment his foot hit the pavement, a searchlight snapped on from across the garage. It was blinding, a pillar of white fire that pinned him like an insect to a board. Ethan recoiled, shielding his eyes, and in that split second of blindness, Sade wrenched herself free. She didn't run for the exit. She ran toward the light, toward the silhouette standing motionless at the center of the beam. Sung-jin stood there, his tailored black overcoat draped over his shoulders, his hands tucked casually into his pockets. He didn't look like a man in a hurry. He looked like a man who had been waiting for this exact moment his entire life. Behind him, the silhouettes of a dozen men formed a wall of silent, imposing muscle, their faces obscured by the glare. Ethan squinted into the light, his chest heaving.
Who are you?
This is a mistake. She's my friend." Sung-jin stepped forward, entering the halo of the light. The tattoos on his neck seemed to writhe in the pulsing red of the emergency strobes. He didn't look at Ethan. He looked at Sade, his eyes scanning her face until they rested on the bruise. His expression didn't change, but the air in the garage seemed to grow thinner, colder. "You've had your fun in the dark, Ethan," Sung-jin said, his voice a smooth, lethal caress. "But the sun doesn't rise in this part of Gangnam unless I say so. And I've decided that for you, the night is never going to end." As Sung-jin spoke, the heavy steel shutters of the garage exits began to grind downward, sealing the exits one by one. The hunter looked around frantically, realizing for the first time that there were no dead zones here. He wasn't in a service basement anymore. He was in a cage, and the man holding the key was the only thing standing between him and the abyss. The blackout hadn't been a glitch. It had been an invitation to a nightmare Ethan was never intended to wake up from. The heavy steel shutters of the garage had sealed with a final, echoing thud, leaving the world outside to wonder why a 3-block radius of Gangnam had suddenly gone dark. Inside, the red emergency strobes pulsed like a dying heart, casting long, rhythmic shadows that made Choi Sung-jin look less like a man and more like a force of nature. Sade stood behind him, her breathing finally slowing as she felt the impenetrable wall of his presence. Across the concrete, Ethan Crowley was crumbling. The man who had spent 3 weeks feeling like a god of the shadows was now a shivering wreck, pinned against a support pillar by the blinding white beam of a tactical searchlight. Sung-jin moved toward him. His footsteps were slow, measured, and carried the heavy, metallic clink of a man who was in no rush because he knew the exits were gone. He didn't pull a weapon. He didn't need one. His hands were tucked into the pockets of his overcoat, his expression as serene as a winter morning in the mountains. "You have a fascinating hobby, Ethan," Sung-jin said, his voice a low, melodic hum that seemed to vibrate through the concrete floor. He stopped just inches away from the stalker, invading his space with the same cold entitlement Ethan had used on Sade. "You like to watch. You like the power of seeing someone who doesn't see you. You think the darkness is your mask." Ethan tried to speak, his teeth chattering so hard he nearly bit his tongue. I didn't cheese, please." Sung-jin leaned in, his face inches from Ethan's. Up close, the tattoos on the boss's neck were sharp and jagged, marking him as a man who had survived a world Ethan couldn't even imagine. Sung-jin reached out, his gloved hand moving with agonizing slowness to adjust the collar of Ethan's damp hood. It was a gesture of terrifying intimacy. "The mistake you made," Sung-jin whispered, his voice dropping to a frequency that felt like a razor blade against the ear, "is thinking that you were the one doing the watching. But in Yeoksam-dong, everything belongs to me. The cameras, the sensors, the very air you're breathing, they all report back to one place." Sung-jin pulled a small, high-resolution tablet from his pocket and held it up. On the screen, a mosaic of dozens of angles showed Ethan's own face, wide-eyed, sweating, and pathetic, captured from the hidden lenses Sung-jin had installed throughout the district. "You like watching people?" Sung-jin's eyes flared with a sudden, dark intensity. "Now, the whole city is watching you die. Not physically, not yet. But I've sent your face, your history, and the footage of what you did tonight to every screen in this district. Every employer, every landlord, every contact in your phone. By the time I'm done with you, you'll be a ghost in a city that won't even let you sleep in an alleyway." Ethan's knees gave out, and he slid down the concrete pillar, a sob breaking from his throat. He realized then that real terror wasn't a physical blow or a gunshot. It was the total, systematic erasure of his existence by a man who treated the city like a chessboard. Sung-jin stood over him, looking down with a flick of his gaze that dismissed Ethan as a mere insect. He turned back toward Sade, his features softening by a fraction of a degree, the only mercy he would show that night. He held out a hand to her, not as a master, but as a guardian. "The night is over, Sade," he said quietly, his voice regaining its cultured, Gangnam polish. "Let's go home. The shadows don't have anything left to say to you." Behind them, the red lights continued to pulse, illuminating the broken man on the floor who had finally learned that in the kingdom of Choi Sung-jin, there was only one predator allowed in the dark. When the sun finally rose over the jagged skyline of Gangnam, it didn't just bring light, it brought a cold, clinical reckoning. The blackout had lasted only an hour, a blip in the city's electrical grid that the authorities dismissed as a technical surge, but the digital aftermath was far more permanent. By 8 a.m., the morning news cycle was already vibrating with a story that made the city's elite pause over their espressos. The headlines didn't mention the Mafia. They didn't mention Choi Sung-jin. Instead, they spoke of a mysterious disappearance and a simultaneous, massive data leak. Ethan Crowley's name was trending, but not for the reasons he had ever imagined. Every predatory message he had sent, every GPS log of his stalking routes, and high-definition footage of his final confrontation in the sub-basement had been uploaded to a public server and mirrored across a dozen underground forums. The morning statement was a masterclass in psychological warfare. It wasn't just that Ethan was gone, it was the way he had been exposed. The city's underground understood the subtext immediately. This wasn't a random act of a whistleblower, this was a marking of territory. The news reports played clips of the dark alleyways of Yeoksam-dong, now swarming with police who found nothing but a discarded hooded jacket and a shattered phone. A shockwave rippled through the shadowed corners of the city. For the creeps who thrived on anonymity and the small-time thugs who thought the busy streets of Gangnam were a playground for the cruel, the message was deafening. There was a new, invisible law in the district. The news anchors speculated about vigilante hackers, but the street knew better. They knew that the king of Yeoksam-dong had broken his silence to protect a delivery girl who was supposed to be invisible. Sung-jin watched the broadcast from his office, the sound muted. He didn't need to hear the reporters' theories. He looked down at the street where the yellow delivery bikes were beginning their morning rounds. The order had been restored, but it was a different kind of order now, one infused with a lingering, respectful fear. Mateo entered the room, setting a tablet on the mahogany desk. The police have officially opened a missing persons file for Crowley, but they won't find a single lead. Every server that hosted the original leak has been wiped, leaving only the public copies they can't control. Sung-jin nodded, his gaze fixed on a single yellow scooter idling at a red light below. The city needed to see what happens when someone mistakes my silence for absence. It wasn't enough to erase him, Mateo. I wanted them to see the void he left behind. The disappearance was a ghost story that would be told in the bars and backrooms of Gangnam for years. It was a warning that the shadows of Yeoksam-dong didn't belong to the cowardly or the cruel. They belonged to the man who could turn off the sun with a single command. The morning statement wasn't just news. It was a treaty signed in neon and shadow, declaring that Sade Williams was no longer a ghost in the city. She was the one woman in Seoul whom the darkness itself had risen to protect. The rain had finally tapered off, leaving the streets of Yeoksam-dong glistening like polished obsidian under the early morning sun. Sade walked toward her parked scooter, her steps no longer hurried or heavy with the itch of being hunted. For the first time in a month, the air in her lungs felt deep and clear. As she reached her bike, she stopped short. Resting on the seat was a small, minimalist box of matte black cardboard, unbranded but smelling faintly of the expensive sandalwood cologne that permeated Sung-jin's office. Inside, she found a new phone, the latest model, its screen unblemished and gleaming, and a heavy, titanium security fob. She picked up the fob, and as her thumb brushed the biometric sensor, a soft, reassuring chime echoed from the device. It wasn't just a key, it was a silent link to a network that owned the city. Along with it was a small, handwritten note on heavy cream cardstock. It didn't contain a romantic poem or a plea for her time. It simply read, "The streets are yours again. I'll make sure they stay that way." Sade felt a strange heat rise in her chest, not the heat of fear, but the warmth of being truly seen. She looked up, her eyes scanning the busy Gangnam morning. A block away, a sleek black sedan with tinted windows sat idling at the light. It didn't move aggressively. It didn't feel like a threat. It sat there with the quiet, watchful patience of a gargoyle guarding a cathedral. She hopped onto her scooter and kicked the engine to life. As she pulled out into the flow of traffic, the black sedan followed, maintaining a respectful, steady distance of exactly 1 block. It was her private escort, a shadow that didn't hide in the dark to hurt, but lived in the light to protect. She wove through the morning rush, the yellow vest of her delivery uniform fluttering in the wind. She was still a girl working for her dreams in a foreign land, still a delivery courier navigating the chaos of Seoul. But as she glanced in her rearview mirror and saw the steady silhouette of the sedan behind her, she realized she was no longer an outsider. The king of Yeoksam-dong had given her back her fire, and in return, she had given him a reason to break his rules. She reached the first delivery stop of the day, parked her bike, and shook the last of the night's dampness from her hair with a defiant, vibrant motion. She didn't look back to see if the car was still there. She knew it was. In the kingdom of Choi Sung-jin, some promises were kept in silence, and some shadows were meant to be shared. Thank you for listening. Don't forget to subscribe for more stories of protection and the ultimate triumph of the human heart. Until next time, stay strong and keep breathing.